Hey, good evening, everybody. This is your host, Nevin Gusak, here at New Ideas. With me is, well, I guess virtually every guest is a friend of the show, is Tim Starr. Tim Starr is a libertarian. He's also very active with the conservatives for Ukraine. He has authored a number of historical pieces on World War I, World War II, and other conflicts and issues in history. He's an expert on national security, economics, history, etc. We have a lot of good offline conversations. He's a type of libertarian, one of the few that I've met that is not too ideologically rigid. He is still, like the show, myself, a determined opponent of socialism and fascism and communism. So it's great to have Tim back. Tim's been doing a lot of research for quite a long time and did a very nicely done presentation on the New Deal. Tim, for a libertarian, has a very nuanced view of the New Deal based on our conversations and some of the points he's made on our last show. So I really look forward to having Tim bring his research here. Whether you agree with it or not, it's certainly going to be a good discussion. And we're also going to be talking about Israel, Iran, and other issues in current events. Welcome back to the show, Tim. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Really looking forward to being able to do this.
Well, great. Well, thank you for the time and for the willingness to come on the show. I always appreciate good guests. And I wanted to you to summarize your views on the New Deal. Now, I remember in the last show, there were some programs that you seem to have accepted, like the PWA and the WPA and others that I think you and I would agree, which were more problematic, like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which can kind of go either way, and the National Recovery Administration, led by the master of the Blue Eagles, General Hugh Johnson. So why don't you go through your presentation, take your time, lay out the data, and we will go from there.
Certainly, I will be happy to do so. I will share my screen. Let's see, I want full screen. There we go. Now to start off with, I want to show my screen anyway. To start off with, I want to, this is not exactly how I want this to be here. Let me change that and I'll open a new window so we can see it here. All right, so to start off with, I read about a dozen books to prepare for this, and one of them just came out, and I didn't have time to change my presentation to add it, but I did read it. It's very good here. It's called False Dawn by George Selgin, who's one of my favorite economic historians. So I just want to plug it here. I think it's the most comprehensive book that I've read covering the topic of the New Deal. And even though he's a libertarian, he tries to take a very objective, pure economics view of it as to what worked, what didn't, and what contributions were made, what actually led to recovery. He has a very useful distinction, I'll get my presentation next, between the three aspects of the New Deal: recovery, reform, and relief. So I just wanted to mention that before I jump into the presentation. So I'll close that, and then we'll see. If I open this, I'll hit present. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the New Deal because I think it's very important to lay the conceptual groundwork for the American economy and what actually did and did not happen in the New Deal and what did and did not work. I found myself disagreeing with both the right-wing and left-wing conventional takes on the New Deal. Specifically, the left wing likes to heap unvarnished praise on the New Deal for supposedly being the ultimate exemplar of Keynesianism in American economic policy. And the right wing likes to unqualifiedly bash the New Deal for the exact same reason, namely that it is supposedly the ultimate expression of Keynesianism in American foreign economic policy. And in fact, as I'll get to, it turns out the New Deal was not all that Keynesian at all. So they're both wrong. But I did read a number of books here, about a dozen books. They're not all listed here. Examples would be, in addition to the George Seligman book I just mentioned, Burton Folsom Jr.'s New Deal or Raw Deal, Amity Shlaes' The Forgotten Man, and Jim Powell's FDR's Folly. I think the two best are Jim Powell's book and George Seligman's book. But I will move on into the presentation. Now, where do I can't remember where the navigation thing is here.
You got to show me how to share the screens. I got to keep up with the tech situation here. So
there it is. Wait a minute. I'm able to do this elsewhere. So I will confess that I use an AI to create my presentation here. Oh, here it is. It's called Gamma, as you can see up in the URL bar. Gamma.app. It's very good. I liked it a lot. Made it really easy. I was able to feed in an outline, and it came up with a lot of this for me. Okay, so I like to break my analysis of economic affairs into three stages, basically. What caused the instability in the economy? What was done? And the main question there is, was it actually a market failure, or was it something that the government did to cause the failure? And then the next stage of the analysis is, what did the government, or is there anything government can do to resolve the economic instability? And maybe there is, maybe there isn't. And then lastly, did the government do that? Or is there anything the government, I guess the better way to put it is, if there is something the government can do to solve the problem, is the government likely to do that, or did they actually do that, historically speaking? So as for root causes here, basically my take on this would be a combination of things. There's a little bit more to it than this, but these are the essential parts. So one of it is that the American economy in the 1920s was still heavily agricultural, but it was transitioning a lot more to an industrial society. But during World War I, we had a massive investment in agriculture by the US government in order to both supply our allies in Europe as well as to feed our own troops that we sent over there. And you have to realize that even though we entered the war at a very late stage, we had no idea how long that war was going to last. It had been either in a stalemate for years, or towards the end, believe it or not, Germany was actually gaining ground right before we entered. So they basically spent a lot of money to invest in agriculture to be able to adequately supply us for a war that would be indefinitely long. And then as soon as the war was over, thank goodness it was over a lot sooner than anyone expected it to be, all of that spending on agriculture was suddenly stopped by the government because they said, hey, we don't need it anymore. But that meant that all of the investments that private farmers had made into land and livestock and equipment and seed and everything was suddenly not worth so much. And a lot of the existing agricultural produce wasn't worth as much either. So there was a massive economic crash in the early 20s because of this. Thankfully, we did recover to come out of it, but it took a couple of years, and agriculture was a lagging part of that recovery because, again, the economy was transitioning out of agriculture. Now, to jump towards the bottom here, the government decided they had a solution to this problem, which is that they were going to protect American agriculture with tariffs They were going to subsidize it. They set up a system basically where the U.S. government would buy surplus agricultural produce from the farmers and then export it overseas. It would be subsidized. A lot of this went into the American Relief Administration run by Hoover that fed a lot of the people in Europe after World War I, as well as in the Soviet Union, which is a bit of a mess there. Hoover ended up basically saving the Bolsheviks from themselves. It's one of the several times that the United States has inadvertently or not saved the Soviet Union from collapse, which is not such a good thing. But it was done to help U.S. agriculture. Now, when the late 20s were coming along, they decided to scale this up, and they started working on a tariff they're going to pass. It's named after the two authors of it. Two primary authors were Smoot and Hawley. And the way that they got the rest of the American, political spectrum to sign on to this was they basically decided to cut everybody in. Everybody's going to get a tariff. It was kind of like one of those Oprah shows where instead of strategically targeting tariffs, saying, this industry or this sector really needs some protection or some help here, which I think is a reasonable type of argument to make. They just said, you get a tariff and you get a tariff. Tariffs for everybody. Ended up with this monster bill that passed. It passed in 1930, but the crash of 29 happened on the day in 1929 that the opposition to the bill in the Senate, I believe, collapsed. And it became clear to Wall Street that the tariff was going to pass. And so that's the day that the massive sell-off happened because, all of the big players on Wall Street figured that this was going to be the start of a trade war, which unfortunately turned out to be the case. So this then caused a shortfall in revenue to the federal government because the U.S. federal government was not really getting that much revenue out of income taxes yet by this time. The income tax was very new. It had only been passed under Wilson, and originally the income tax was only targeted at the very wealthy. It had a very low maximum rate of, I believe, about 5%. I can't remember exactly what the rate was, but it was actually passed by Wilson, not really intended as a revenue measure or even a way to correct the distribution of wealth in the country all that much. It was really passed as a way to punish the North because the North was still the richest part of the country. Wilson was a Southerner, and almost nobody in the South made enough money to be subject to the income tax as it was originally passed, and it was only those damn Yankees that were going to pay it. Now, Hoover.
I'm one of those damn Yankees. I'm from New York, for those who don't know. So.
Yes. And Hoover basically saw that there was this, massive shortfall in federal revenue thanks to this tariff that he had fully supported. The Republicans were the tariff party back then. The Democrats were the anti-tariff party. So in order to make up for that revenue shortfall, he decided to increase income tax rates. Now, because the Republicans had been in power through the 20s, after World War I, there had actually been a steady process of adjusting income tax rates downward because Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon had figured out that cutting tax rates resulted in more revenue at the time. And he was never able to get them down as far as he wanted to, but he said he thought the ideal tax rate would be about a rate of about 10%, which he likened to tithing to the church. And that was purely in terms of maximizing revenue. But at any rate, Hoover wasn't having any of that. He wasn't a believer in that. And he raised income taxes to 63% in 1932. And this basically killed what little recovery was already underway by that point. And the economy basically stalled and went into a tailspin and never really got out of it, as we'll see, until after World War II. So, moving on to my next slide, as soon as I can remember how to, here we go, down here at the bottom, that's where it is. All right, so what was the New Deal and what did it do? So it was a set of programs. This slide here is about one of them. There were a bunch of, they called them what, alphabet agencies, or they had all these abbreviations. This is the AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act. And basically the goal of this was to raise farm prices. And so their way of trying to raise farm prices, you could sort of call this a supply side solution to the problem, except that it was by trying to reduce supply. They basically decided the problem was that there was too much agricultural produce on the market, and they had to reduce the amount of it. So they paid farmers infamously to destroy crops and livestock at a time when there was a lot of people who were going hungry and they couldn't afford stuff to eat. A lot of them were, getting food relief aid either from their local government or from the federal government, when the federal government decided it had to get into that business as well. So this is basically a price fixing scheme. And I think it's ironic that since the 1890s, the United States had passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. And one of the things about the Sherman Antitrust Act is that it made price fixing illegal. So if the private sector conspires to reduce supply in order to raise prices, that's crime and it's illegal, and everybody thought it was bad. But if the federal government did it, somehow that was okay. Don't know why they thought that, but apparently they did. The other fun thing about this is that this is not exactly part of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, but there was also a thing called the prevailing wage rule that was passed to basically say that the federal government would only pay in its contracts with the private sector. It only entered into contracts with companies that paid their employees what was called the prevailing wage, which basically meant the union wage. So if a sector was unionized, I don't know how much of the country it had to be unionized in, they would basically go ask, what is the prevailing wage for union workers in that sector of the economy? Say, okay, that's what we're going to pay in all our federal contracts. But the thing is that at that time, a lot of workers, a lot of Black workers, African-American workers, were not unionized. A lot of unions did not allow them. Some did, but most of them didn't. And so their wages were generally lower than those of the prevailing wages. And so they got priced out of the labor market for all the sectors that were covered by those federal contracts. Moving on. So one of the main things that the New Deal did was these massive public works projects. And the biggest one of them was called the Tennessee Valley Authority. Basically a series of dams on this river in the Tennessee Valley to generate electricity. And the theory was that the South was not that electrified yet. So if we give the South electricity, that'll help the South get richer. And there's a lot of poor people there, especially in the Tennessee Valley. It was known as a poor region at the time. And we get these other benefits too, supposedly. We get, flood control, we get power generation. And what they ended up finding, what ended up happening was that in the name of flood control, they flooded more land than would have been flooded in 500 years of floods. In the name of the generation of hydroelectric power, You can see these great pictures of it. It's still around. These, wonderful water turbines coming out from under the dam, lovely spray of water. It's very impressive. But historically, most of the electricity produced by the TVA has come from coal, not hydro. Another one of the justifications for it was that, if you flood this river valley, then you have lakes, and lakes can be used to transport material on shipping. Well, that's true, but most of the shipping on those lakes is for the coal that is used by the TVA to generate that power. And then lastly, not only were a lot of poor people forced off their land when it was flooded by the TVA, but a lot of the people who were displaced like that were lower income, either whites or blacks, and a lot of them were not well enough educated to work for the TVA after that. So they didn't really benefit from the jobs that were created by the TVA itself. And then one last thing about this is that, because agriculture was an underperforming part of the U.S. economy at the time, so the TVA did subsidize agriculture in the region. But because of that, economists who've analyzed it have determined that they basically retarded economic growth in that area by keeping people in agriculture instead of allowing them to transition into other types of work that were going to be more productive and more remunerative for them afterwards. So, and this is a good example here. It's not the only one. There were lots of others, of course, but this is the biggest one. And I think it's pretty representative of what a lot of these public works projects were. Now, some of them were done purely as a form of relief. So, for instance, my wife's father worked building a road in Colorado through Rocky Mountain National Park. And, the road's still there, and he was paid $1 a day in silver back in the 1930s. That was a very good wage. But basically, they did things like that just to keep people, afloat economically because they couldn't get jobs otherwise. So that's not the kind of thing I'm talking about here. What I'm really saying is that in terms of long-term economic recovery, these public works projects didn't really contribute to recovery. All right, now I'm going to move on here to the next slide, just a few more. Now, this is one that's very infamous, the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, not the National Rifle Association. I always got that confused when I first started reading about this stuff. So NRA here means National Recovery Administration. This is a cartelization of the economy into industrial sectors. They published a national business code for these industries. The intent was for each industry to come up with its own business codes, and some of them did eventually, but until they did, they were supposed to abide by this one standard centralized business code for all. And it had a lot of the same goals as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, in that the idea was to restrict competition so that there wouldn't be too much production, and that would keep prices high, which would make the producers, incomes higher. This was challenged in the Supreme Court. It was struck down. There was a case known as the Schechter case. It's not the only one, but in that case, there was a couple of Jewish kosher butchers who were not abiding by those industry codes because it just didn't really apply to how they did business. I don't remember the details right now. And it turns out a lot of what was happening under the guise of this standardization of businesses was that the bigger businesses in each of these industries was trying to squeeze out their competition on the low end. So if they had competitors who had lower production costs and lower prices and perhaps also lower quality, they were going to be squeezed out of the market by this. It was struck down in court, but even before it was struck down in court, it was basically a dead letter because it was too hard to enforce. So the federal government basically just gave up on even trying to enforce it. And then after it was struck down by the Supreme Court, Roosevelt thought this was a bad thing because it undermined his authority as president. So he proposed the idea of adding a whole bunch of new judges to the Supreme Court that he would appoint. And presumably these appointees would be a lot more amenable to upholding measures like this. Fortunately, I would say that courts packing scheme was wildly unpopular on both sides of the political aisle at the time, and it was abandoned. And ever since then, the Supreme Court's number of justices has remained the same. There's been a real taboo on that. Now, another interesting thing here, as I mentioned earlier, that the New Deal was not really all that Keynesian. John Maynard Keynes himself commented on the NRA, and he basically condemned it. He said it was a bad thing because it was too hard on business, and business is what was needed in order to have economic recovery. He said basically there's no way you're going to get, the economy to grow again if you keep, going after business, which is what Roosevelt had been doing. So moving on, let's see here. So the next one here. So I did want to bring up these other measures here about Social Security and monetary policy, because Social Security was adopted in the later part of the New Deal as a state subsidized pension scheme for retirees. Now, this was modeled on the system that Bismarck originated in Wilhelmine, Germany. And what I thought was really interesting about that was I was reading a history of the Second Reich, Wilhelmine, Germany, and it pointed out that the reason why this was adopted, state pensions were adopted in Germany at the time, was that the working class was upset. The Socialist Party, Democratic Socialist Party, SDP of Germany, was the biggest socialist party in the world at the time. Bismarck was worried about them threatening both his power and the stability of the German system as a whole. But what I thought was really interesting about this, why were they so upset? They were upset because Germany had just passed an agricultural tariff to protect the incomes of all of the rich German landowners who were, all their income came from agricultural produce. The Junkers in Prussia, but also throughout the rest of Germany. And Germany did this basically because they decided that these large landowners were the best people to compose the officer class for the German military. So they thought this was a national security justification, but it made the working class very unhappy. They were very pro-free trade at the time. In the 19th century, free trade was very much a left-wing working class issue in most of the world, certainly Europe. So Bismarck decided, okay, to mollify the working class, I'm going to implement a state pension system, which is basically the same reason that we adopted Social Security. Now, however, when Bismarck implemented it, he had it set to kick in, I forget exactly what age it is. It might have been age 70. Basically, he set the date when the pensions would start to be higher than the life expectancy of the average worker. So you were supposed to feel good as a worker in Germany because you were going to get a pension if you actually made it to retirement before dying. And similar things happened with Social Security. For instance, it initially excluded farm workers entirely, which were, again, a lot of African Americans and poor whites. And the initial retirement age for Social Security was not set above life expectancy for whites, but it was set above the life expectancy for blacks. So it ended up being a net transfer from the poor to the rich because the poor paid Social Security taxes, but the poorest of them were not eligible for the benefits. And the other thing is that historically, the returns on Social Security have been much lower than private investments would have been. If people had put that same amount of money that they paid to Social Security taxes into private investment accounts, like it's done in some countries like Singapore or Chile, the return would have been probably, I ran some estimates on this, roughly double. So people getting twice as much money in return for that. Next, I want to cover Roosevelt basically declaring that contracts requiring payment in gold were no longer going to be valid. This was done by executive order, and it applied to government contracts as well as private sector contracts. So naturally, of course, this went to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, it was not struck down in the Supreme Court, and Roosevelt actually also banned the private ownership of monetary gold at the time. So everybody who had gold had to turn it in. So everybody who had been taking their gold out of the bank had to give it back. Now, this did put a lot more monetary gold back into the banking system, which did help stabilize it. But the other thing here is that by saying that the U.S. government and all these other private sector contracts were no longer payable in monetary gold at the old rate, which was about $20 an ounce of gold, this discouraged foreign investment in the U.S. because basically, a bunch of foreign investors like France had, invested expecting to be repaid at a certain rate, and they basically were told, no, that's not going to happen anymore. So not only did they not want to do that, they also decided that, if they could get their gold out of the United States, they would do so any way they possibly could. So there was a run on gold from the U.S. banking system into foreign banks. And this is part of why Roosevelt decided he had to freeze the banking system, declare a national bank holiday, which it turns out had actually been planned by Hoover, and Hoover's people were the ones that coordinated that all before Roosevelt took office. Just Hoover felt like it wasn't right for him to do it after he had lost the election. And Roosevelt didn't give Hoover permission to do it until he took office. So there was a big delay in that whole process. Arguably, there did need to be a readjustment of the price of gold, which is what ended up happening. But it was devalued quite a bit. It went from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. And I think this is a much bigger deal than a lot of people recognize, because if you look at the net consumer price inflation in the U.S. between 1789 and 1933, if you round it down to the nearest single digit in dollars, that CPI change comes out to exactly zero. So we had some fluctuation, but the net over that period of time was a 0% change in consumer prices. And then all of a sudden we had this enormous jump in the 1930s. Fortunately, that held until the early 70s. But there was a big adjustment that had to be made there. One last other thing I want to mention here on monetary policy is that one of the things that Roosevelt did was to win support with silver miners in the American West, like Nevada. They adopted a policy of buying silver for the U.S. Mint and coining it at a rate that was above the world price for silver. And while this was a good thing for the miners and the silver industry in the U.S., it had a very bad effect on China, because China was still on the silver standard. They were the only major country in the world that was still on the silver standard at the time. So what this meant is that everybody who had silver in the Chinese market started withdrawing it and selling it in the US instead, because it was worth more here than it was there. And this was very inflationary in China. This is a big part of what destabilized China, causing inflation. Inflation caused corruption. Corruption made the nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek more unpopular. It made it harder for them to fight the Japanese when the Japanese invaded. And ultimately, it contributed to the Maoist communist takeover of China. So I just wanted to put that in there as an example of something that it was actually fairly well known at the time, but a lot of people have forgotten about it these days, as something where the unintended consequences of what these are ostensibly purely domestic policies done for domestic political reasons can have global ramifications that can be very bad. All right. Moving on. Now, what some people do say is that even though maybe, and even Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau in about 1940 was testifying to Congress about the New Deal, and he basically said, we've spent more money than we ever have before, and we've, reformed more than we ever have before, and we've built all these public works projects that we never built before at the federal level. And it basically has not worked in the sense of restarting the American economy. They kept it going in a sort of legacy as is status where things were kind of frozen in place. Unemployment was still quite high, I believe around 14, 15% by 1940. So a lot of people would say, well, okay, yes, but what really happened is that World War II came along and suddenly the government spent a whole lot more money. And that's why when World War II was over, the Depression also was over. It never came back, supposedly. So I'm pretty convinced that's wrong. And here's what really happened. So there was a big shift in FDR's attitude towards business. There's a great quote from him where he said basically that Dr. New Deal was going to retire and Dr. Win the War was going to take over. And this is because he figured out that after the fall of France, America was going to have to enter the war on Britain's side, and we were going to need an enormous amount of military equipment and supplies produced, and there was no way to do that without bringing business in on the process. So at that point, they adopted a completely new system where, a lot of the demonization of business that they had been doing with, antitrust laws and such and regulatory enforcement, they basically said, never mind that now, that's not so important. Now they did adopt things like cost plus contracts for war production, but they also adopted an excess profits tax on that. So you couldn't have people who were just, running up the costs like crazy in order to make a huge pile of money as war profiteers, because if their profits were too high, that was going to get taxed at a really high rate also. But this resulted in a huge amount of economic activity. So for instance, these days, a lot of people make a big deal about U.S. industrial employment. Well, U.S. industrial employment peaked during World War II. And it's basically been on the decline one way or another, in manufacturing, ever since. And thankfully, the private sector did a very good job of this. It was a huge contributor. I would argue that without it, not only would we not have won the war, the Soviet Union would not have been able to defeat Germany at all, because they were very dependent on us via Lend-Lease. Britain could very well have fallen also. And World War II would have turned out very differently. One example of this is that for the U.S. Air Force, it was called the U.S. Army Air Corps at the time, the planes that we all flew, almost all of them had been designed before the war, and they were better than the planes that anyone else had, largely because they had been designed by private industry before the war. whereas our tanks, the Sherman tanks, were not that good because they had been designed by the Army. U.S. industry was able to improve them a great deal, but they were still, in a lot of ways, not as good as the tanks fielded by other forces in the war. There's some debate about that, but in terms of actual, tank quality itself, I think they were not as good. So then what really happened to end it is that at the end of the war, there was a massive post-war boom. And there were several things that contributed to that. So one of them was that the Republicans took over the House and Senate in the elections in 1946, and they abolished wage and price controls. And a lot of people were afraid at the time that this was going to return us to Depression-era unemployment levels. Because not only were wage and price controls abolished, but also there was an enormous number of millions of U.S. servicemen who were coming back home from overseas and entering the job market. So there's a lot of fear that this was going to crowd the job market too much. Another thing that happened was that there was this bit of a stealth tax cut. So there were two ways to calculate taxes in different states, depending on whether they had common law marriage or not. And if you had common law marriage, that meant for a husband and wife, they could combine their income for tax purposes to determine their income tax rate, and they would be taxed at whatever the percentage was for that income level. This was not the case originally back then, before this change was made, for states that were not common law marriage states. So in those states, if you had a husband who was earning a lot and a wife who was not earning so much, the husband would be taxed at a much higher tax rate than the wife. And so there was a bit of a shift. A bunch of states figured this out and decided, hey, we're going to switch to common law marriage so that our people don't have to pay that much in taxes compared to the states that were common law marriage states. And at that point, the feds basically decided to preempt it and say, okay, we're just going to make this change nationwide for everybody. So everybody, if you want to have your tax rates calculated as if you had a common law marriage by adding your income together, then you can do that. So this was a massive tax cut that is really not well known anymore. And there were a couple other things that happened here that I got out of George Selgin's book, which were very important. So one was that during the war, there was rationing of a whole ton of consumer goods. So what this meant was that there were a lot of, sort of luxury consumer goods, or maybe not so luxury, but they were considered unnecessary luxuries during the war that people just couldn't buy. Or the ways that they just couldn't spend their money. For instance, all the horse races in the country were shut down. It never would have occurred to me, but they decided, that was just not something that people needed to be spending on their money on while there was a war on. So when rationing was abolished, there was a huge amount of pent-up consumer demand for these consumer goods and services that was suddenly unleashed. And also, what had been people doing with their money during the war? Instead of spending it on consumer goods, they've been saving it. So U.S. savings rates were really high. I believe, if I remember correctly, Selgin says we had, I think, a 30% savings rate right after World War II, which is huge compared to now. And now I think it's maybe, I know it's less than 10%. It might be something like 2 or 3%. I have to look it up to be sure. But we had an enormous amount of private savings. We had a huge amount of pent-up consumer demand that suddenly got unleashed. Now, there were a lot of fears about this having an inflationary effect, causing prices to skyrocket. And according to Selgin, that didn't happen basically because the U.S. government decided to pay down a whole lot of the debt that it had racked up during the war to pay for the war. So this had a deflationary effect on the money supply at the same time that the massive increase in consumer demand had an inflationary effect. And they basically canceled each other out, or if perhaps the deflationary effect might have even been greater than the inflationary effect. So that is what I gathered, from all the reading and research that I did. What really caused the recovery from the Great Depression, and a lot of it lasted for a long time. As I mentioned, the gold price remained at $35 an ounce until the early 70s. Tariffs had actually peaked during the Great Depression, and then they were steadily and gradually reduced, pretty much starting with Roosevelt. They generally were reduced as a process of negotiation between the executive branch and those of other countries. Originally just Roosevelt himself, and then later things like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and then now we have later agreements like, I can't remember what the latest one is, but Trump's trying to do some more of that. He's trying to raise tariffs in the other direction now, but the overall trend since the war was for them to gradually go down. So with that, that basically completes my presentation, and I will close that down and we can go back to each other, and I will stop sharing my screen. We no longer have the infinity effect going on. So, I know you said that when you were looking this over, it triggered some memories of you about the NRA and the guy who was in charge of the NRA. Was it Hugh Johnson? Is that right?
That's right. Before we go into, I'm going to give a presentation that, is more supportive of many aspects, though not all of the New Deal. But there are some criticisms I have. The NRA. I also had some follow-up questions, so we both get our drinks. I got to do a refill on my tea. I think you earned yours because you've been talking for like almost an hour, which is good. So I think you've earned your break, but for a little bit at least. But before I go, I wanted to ask you, because peppered in our private conversations and even in one of our last, at least one of our shows, your views are not like particularly rigid, though, and you confirm that in the beginning. Like you, for example, seem to be accepting or praiseworthy of public works or certain aspects of the public works of the PWA, WPA. You're not overtly hostile to unions. You feel that seems like you didn't elaborate too much on that. And I wanted to ask you, what did the New Deal get right? What should it have done to make it better? Mm-hmm. And because I also was doing research on the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, mm-hmm. Which was spearheaded, if I recall correctly, by Secretary of Agriculture, later future Vice President, one of Roosevelt's vice presidents, Henry Wallace.
Right.
And because the situation, and I'll let you elaborate while I get my drink so you can talk to the audience. You had a problem of overproduction, which spurred the AAA. But as you had mentioned, you had the situation where farmers were killing their livestock, were cutting down on crop production, and that also had adverse effects, obviously, especially in a country that was starving. It was probably, along with the NRA, probably the two most controversial New Deal programs, which, if I recall correctly, even split the New Deal community too as well. Now, what did the New Deal get correct, and what should have government as well as the private sector done to handle the problem of overproduction? I hate to put you on the spot, mm-hmm. As well as also make sure that they really didn't kill all this livestock. I mean, I don't have the statistics in front of me. I mean, because I love my animals, although I am a meat eater, so it's a bit of a contradiction. But the thought of killing animals, I mean, just not even for food, it just, these sort of sentimental reasons, is disturbing, as well as the crops.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to, before I go into my facts and opinions, take it away.
Okay, sure, no problem. So to start with, what should the New Deal have done differently? Well, they did start reducing tariffs. I think they should have done that a lot more quickly. If you're going to have tariffs, I think they need to be strategic and targeted. And these just weren't. It was, like I said, tariffs for everybody. Also, I think the national bank holiday needed to happen a lot sooner. Ideally, while Hoover was still in office. I really wish Roosevelt had, given approval to that after the election before taking office, but he just didn't do that for political reasons. Now, Selgin came up with a very good answer to this question about what did the New Deal get right. So he pointed out that one of the big problems that people had was similar to what we just had recently with the global financial crisis, which is that people got stuck with bad mortgages. So as part of what happened with the Depression was that prices fell, including the price of housing that people had bought with mortgages. And so their mortgages were underwater, and they also didn't have enough income to make the payments on those mortgages as easily as they had when they originally bought those houses. And so Selgin points out that there was a U.S. government agency that basically came up with a process for renegotiating these mortgages with the lenders, the banks, and the borrowers, where they were able to readjust the mortgages to make them so that they were a lot more affordable to the borrowers, but also a lot less subject to the probability of default for the banks. Unfortunately, I'm blanking on the name of that thing at the time. I'm sure he would know it off the top of his head, but it's in his book. So that I thought was a very interesting example of something the New Deal did right and was a good thing. Now, one of the other things that they could have done differently is actually monetary policy. So there was a point somewhere in the middle of the New Deal where what's happening is that even though I mentioned how Roosevelt struck down the gold clause in all these contracts, said, hey, we said we're going to pay in gold, but sorry, we're not. Haha. Gold, after a while, gold actually did start coming back into the country. And this was because Hitler took power in Germany and started scaring people in the rest of Europe. And so a lot of the European banks started sending their gold here into our banking system because it was considered safer here than there. And so this actually contributed to a lot of the recovery that did happen in the U.S. economy during the Depression until it would get, choked off in one way or another by something else that the government did. But that did have an inflationary effect in terms of increasing the money supply. I'm not talking about price levels, but the amount of money there was in the economy. I knew an economist once who gave a great quote from, I think, his grandmother about the Great Depression, where he asked her what the Depression was like, and he said, there wasn't any money, simply put. And, monetary gold is money. That money goes into the U.S. banking system. That's reserves that can be used to lend against by the banking system. And businesses can borrow that, and they can start getting their businesses going again. They can invest more, then it can expand. So that did happen to some extent until there was a point in about 1937 where the Federal Reserve decided that there was too much risk of this causing prices to rise again. And they decided to do, can't remember the exact word for it, to sterilize the gold inflows, which basically meant as gold came in, the Federal Reserve would sell off other assets it had to offset the dollar value of that gold that was coming in, so that their balance sheet would remain the same. So they didn't allow the nation's monetary reserves to go up because they're afraid of it causing prices to go up. They could have just allowed that to happen. They probably should have. I don't see why it would have been a bad thing. And one thing you have to remember here is that when the crash happened, I can't remember the exact amount, but the price level fell a lot. And so there was a legitimate need to get prices up, but the only way to do that was to get more money into the banking system. And that was actually happening with the gold inflows, but the feds decided, oh, this is bad and we can't have that. So it's kind of weird, because I think the vast majority of mainstream economists since the Great Depression have decided that the problem was just what I've been saying, that there wasn't enough money in the US economy. And a lot of them are recommending inflation because of that. And so that's how they've been trying to deal with later financial crises. But I don't think they've been doing that in the right way for the most part. Namely, trying to increase the amount of hard assets in the banking system in total, as opposed to just printing dollars. And then the other thing is that I have a hard time arguing against federal relief efforts when you have unemployment that is that high. I think it was up to something like 25% at its maximum, and I don't think it ever went down below about 14% before the war. And I just think that's a very difficult situation for a lot of people to be in. Now, that kept us going. It kept things alive in a sort of steady state. It did not result in increased total investment in the private sector. So it didn't really contribute to recovery. It was only supposed to be a temporary thing. And interestingly, that was the only thing, relief was really the only thing that Roosevelt was really willing to do deficit spending for before the war. Again, he's attacked as this horrible Keynesian who supposedly practiced massive deficit spending. He really wasn't. He was very much a big believer in balanced budgets, even though he did practice some exceptions to that principle, but he did it for the sake of work relief. And the theory again is that was supposed to be temporary until the economy got going again and people could find other jobs outside of government relief jobs. Now there were some other problems with that where people were allowed into those work relief programs in some cases based on their political affiliation. Some people were requiring you to wear, buttons on your outfit, your clothing, or your uniform, whatever it was, saying you were, in favor of Roosevelt or the Democrats in order to get those jobs. So that I wouldn't go along with. But again, I'm not enough of a purist to say that, with 25% unemployment, you can't have work relief until the economy gets any better. Now, I think the government could have done a lot more to make the economy better faster, but that was an unrelated problem. So does that answer your question a little bit?
No, it's a good answer. It's very rare that you have people that are free market advocates or libertarians that even concede that in the New Deal. So, and that's one of the many reasons why I enjoy our conversations, because you're nuanced, and I'm sure you enjoy me as a New Deal advocate, where there are aspects of the FDR administration that I'm very critical of. So, to establish a point of commonality, where Tim and I come from is support for capitalism, for free enterprise, relatively free competition, private property, the principle of profit, which is the lifeblood in any free economy. There's no question. Tim and I agree with that. I think virtually 80 to 90% of my guests, I have some guests from the left, but not the totalitarian left. But 80% of my guests agree with that. And my program, where I use seemingly at times progressive and populist policies, when I use it, and actually I did an analysis on Grok of my writings and had Grok analyze it. And it really kind of had me pegged, because it said that, yes, I advocate progressive and nationalist and populist policies, but it's deployed for a goal of strengthening capitalism or perceivably right-wing goals. It's to basically steal the thunder from neo-fascism or communism or socialism today, to see what works and doesn't work. Now, and these are in my essays, and I know Tim is one of my 95, 96 subscribers. You've read some of my essays on the economics. So I'm going to start with the programs that I supported in the New Deal are the Works Progress Administration, Public Works Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Social Security Act. And I would also say I supported some of the legislation like the Glass-Steagall Act, which was act of Congress, actually, of course, signed by the president, but it emanated from the Congress, and not liberals either. They were Southern Democrats, as a matter of fact. I also supported the legalization of collective bargaining, because in a free society, having organized labor, as long as they're controlled by non-communists or non-fascists, then strength in numbers can negotiate in good faith. I am for what Russell Kirk, the famous conservative philosopher, said that he really would like to see. He wrote about the need for genuinely educated trade union leaders and business people. And I think with most trade union leaders that I have looked up to, by and large, like a George Meany or Elaine Kirkland, they understood within the basic outlines and the basic thrust of a relatively free market economy, whereas there are other union leaders, whether it was the IWW during the 1920s into 1930s, or the pre-1947 CIO, or Andy Stern of I don't think he's the president of the SEIU anymore, or William Winspensinger. These are ardent socialists. They had another agenda, I would argue, and were using trade unionism and labor union activities to implement a goal that I think most unionists would oppose, long-term goals, that is. So, I'm just reading from my essays, and just bear with me in quotes. So, to start off, Lawrence Davidson, he observed that in the 100th, here lies the problem that I had from not only a moral point of view, because I do believe in a degree of equity in the framework that I term shared but earned prosperity. And as well as there's also a domestic/national security concern too, where Lawrence Davidson observed that in the 132 years between 1797 and 1929, there was no effective regulation of the U.S. economy. No federal agencies existed to control corruption, fraud, and exploitation on the part of the business class. Even during the Civil War, economic management on a national level was minimal and war profiteering common. Of course, there are some exceptions to that. Foreign trade and tariffs was one, particularly under the Whigs, Federalists, then the Whigs, and then the Republican Party. The National Bureau of Economic Research reported that in the United States experienced 33 major economic downturns, with impacted roughly 60 of the years in question. These included, just gotta move this. These included 22 recessions, 4 depressions, and 7 economic panics, bank runs, and failures. So you had that framework. Now, I will say that Frank Morgan wrote a heterodox book about our founding years. There was state intervention, though, early in our U.S. economy. There was the Homestead Act. There was support for infrastructure, even new technology, I believe, like the telegraph, the railroads. There was, of course, tariff protection. There was support for what was then infrastructure. It was called then internal improvements. So I will put an asterisk with what Mr. Davidson said. Also, You did have a number of benevolent barons, to quote Quentin Skrevic, who's a university professor. I forget the name of the university in Ohio. He's a professor of business history. And there were quite a few benevolent capitalists at the time, even during the Gilded Age. So I do want to put that background because I want to make things as specific as possible and honest as possible. Now, concerning the Great Depression issue, the 1920, the income tax, which was formed, as you said correctly, was passed by Wilson and the Congress. It affected the very, very top layers of the American economy, of the American community, and Harding and Coolidge lowered them substantially, and this was particularly under Treasury Secretary Mellon. That's very well known. And I think you even indicated that, or you did indicate that earlier
right.
in the talk.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, concerning the Depression, there was a lot of unrest. There was a lot of disillusionment. There was a lot of radicalization. You had the Socialist Party growing in strength. You had the Communist Party USA growing in strength, even at 90,000 people in 1939. You had a racial populist Mississippi governor, Theodore Bilbo, observed that folks are restless. Communism is gaining a foothold. In fact, I'm getting a little pink myself. You know, I'm sure you've heard of Bilbo. There were two kinds of Dixiecrats. There were the racial populists that supported the New Deal, but only for whites only, like Congressman, and I think he later was a senator, John Rankin. And then you had Bilbo. You had Huey Long, who was not a racist, at least not as blatant as Bilbo or Rankin. And then you had ones that were plantation owners, the Bourbon Democrats or Redeemer type Democrats, that were basically what Nancy McLean, the historian, would refer to as property supremacists, like James Eastland, who combined racial white supremacy with this strong support for an oligarchic form of property relations. With that stated, I know that's a little bit of a tangent, but the 1920s was characterized by several things. There was rampant speculation, stock speculation, asset speculation, commodities speculation. There was also, as libertarians, Milton Friedman, Pat Choate, who's not a libertarian, but has also indicated this, that there was an increase in the Federal Reserve's money supply. So it really created a perfect storm. As Eric Girding wrote, the 1920s witnessed a relaxation of antitrust laws, deregulation of the banking industry, and a laissez-faire attitude towards securities markets, including burgeoning margin loans for stock speculation. And really, when you think of that type of capitalism, if you want to even call it that, it's very short-term in thinking. It doesn't really take into account the larger institutional ramifications of those activities. And, you know, even during the Great Depression, predatory capitalist behavior continued and select Americans continued to profit off their countrymen's misery. I'm just reading from my thing, you know, because I can't remember all this extemporaneously. I'm sorry. Oil man Joseph Pointer asked, in respect to short selling speculation, how is that a practice so contrary to public policy can be permitted in this country? In whose possession are the 20 billions that disappear from the pockets of the carpenter, the actor, the small executive, and the chorus girl? William Buck, and let me know, audience as well as Tim, if I'm going too fast. William Buck, a Philadelphia salesman, observed that short sellers were people who put profits before patriotism and foreigners who wish no good to the United States. The Kansas Republican Charles Scott advised President Herbert Hoover that, quote, if you can succeed in suppressing short selling in stocks and bonds and food products, it will win you the vote of every Republican farmer in this country. And before I continue reading, what's interesting about this, it's characterized the American economy, really what it's been growing since the onset of the early 1980s, late 1970s, by the way. It's a familiar historical pattern. Herbert Hoover himself wrote in early 1932, men are not justified in deliberately making a profit from the losses of other people. He perhaps correctly even observed to columnist Mark Sullivan, the only trouble with capitalism is capitalists. They're too damn greedy. Now, Hoover, contrary to what people might learn in mainstream textbooks, at least how I learned it initially, and granted, the history is simplified for the people that are younger. Herbert Hoover wasn't like a strict laissez-faire institutionally necessarily. He created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation with the theory that if you give business and banks and states the money, that it would trickle down ultimately to the people. He also passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. That's really not something I would have done because it actually did not meaningfully ameliorate the Depression, the conditions in the Depression. And what's interesting about even, and this I found very interesting, but even President Hoover opposed Smoot-Hawley and only reluctantly signed the bill. He called Smoot-Hawley vicious, extortionate, and obnoxious on the account that it would undermine international cooperation, because Hoover was an economic nationalist. He actually was on record in 1953 as opposing the various reciprocal trade agreements that were being passed. He warned that it would cause desolation in industrial cities and towns, and of course he was correct. But he was also an internationalist, and he was not opposed to trade either. Now, however, there is a lot of convincing empirical evidence that did say, and you really didn't say it, but I want to talk to the audience about it more, that Smoot-Hawley made the Depression worse. And the former chairman of the International Trade Commission, that was the successor, it continues today, the International Trade Commission, which used to be called the Tariff Commission until the mid-1970s. Alfred E. Eckes, who wrote a fantastic book on the history of American trade, it's like a thick tome. He argued that the Smoot-Hawley tariff had little effect on the severity of the Great Depression, while Douglas A. Irwin in the Review of Economics and Statistics also pointed out that foreign trade in the 1920s and early 1930s represented a small amount of American economic activity. Foreign trade was about 1.3% of our GDP. Our tariff rate did increase to the highest, as you pointed out, from 44.6% to 53.2%, which was nowhere near the quantum leap alleged by a lot of the free traders. But the tariffs were always very high on the Republicans, and the way they justified it in their platform, not entirely off base, was high tariffs would basically ensure a higher standard of living for the working class because, look, Great Britain tried to dump their products into the American market in the beginning of the country. And you had even tariff opponents like Thomas Jefferson and also Andrew Jackson reversing their positions on that in order to protect America's nascent industries, in part because of national security. So let me just leave this area here, but just bear with me here and just got my train of thought. So you had really a backdrop of this. So in the 1920s, as Jonathan Levy wrote, initially at the birth of mass production, industrial corporate profits ran far ahead of wages. Working people did not participate in the 1920s speculative investment boom. Increasing economic inequality put more money in the hands of the wealthy who kept bidding up stock prices, increasing their incomes from asset price appreciation leveraged by credit, while labor incomes at the bottom of the distribution stagnated. And what was interesting is that there was the growth of extremism even then, anti-capitalist. Now, a lot of people think the Ku Klux Klan was a sort of ultra-conservative movement, that because they were against socialism and communism, that meant that they were against state intervention in the economy. Well, they combined racialism and populism tremendously. There was a statistic by an anarcho-capitalist that actually did a very good paper. I think it might have been Zotterine, I think. I forget his last name, but it talked about there was polls done of Klans members, and they actually supported a tremendous amount of state intervention in the economy and even nationalization. Why? Because you had this backdrop occurring of increasing number of people being left behind during the quote-unquote Roaring Twenties. So you had Hiram Evans, who was the imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan from 1922 to 1939. He admitted there has been a widespread feeling amongst Klansmen, and in the last few years, the operation of the national government has shown weakness, indicating a possible need of rather fundamental reform. When the Klan speaks of fundamental reform, it's not like Nevin Gussack calling for fundamental reform. The Klan wants an authoritarian dictatorship. You look at D.C. Stevenson, who was the head of the Klan in Indiana during much of the 1920s, and he ran it as an authoritarian police state. He was corrupt, and he was a womanizer and a sex pest of the worst sort. And he was also not trying to blacklist every socialist, but he also moved from socialism to Klan ideology, which is interesting. In 1923, a letter written by a Klan opponent to the editor of the left wing, The New Republic, claimed first, and The New Republic was then a far-left publication. First, throughout all classes, there is growing skepticism of democracy, especially of the current American brand. Many Americans believe there is little even-handed justice administered in the courts, that a poor man has little chance against a rich one, that many judges practically buy their places on the bench or are put there by powerful interests. The strong, able young man comes out of college ready to do his part in politics, but with the settled conviction, unless he can give full time, there is no use bucking up against the machine. Furthermore, he believes that the machines will be equally corrupt. The miner in West Virginia sees the power of the state enlisted on the side of the mine owner. And, you know, what's very interesting is during that time period, you also had, during the Depression, and this is really fascinating, there was actually, this is sad, well, it's not sad, but surprising. In the first 8 months of 1931, Amtorg, which was the Soviet trade corporation in the U.S. and back since the early 1920s, it was based in New York, incidentally, and they were allowed to be based in New York. I mean, contrary to what people might think, before Roosevelt tragically recognized the USSR, which was one of probably his worst foreign policy decisions ever made, one of the handful of worst foreign policy decisions made by an American president, as far as I'm concerned. But anyways, Amtorg, in the first 8 months of 1931, received more than 100,000 applications for jobs in the USSR. The prospective immigrants listed the following reasons for immigrating to the Soviet Union for employment: unemployment, disgust with conditions here, and interest in the Soviet experiment. You had the membership of the Socialist Party increased from 15,000 in 1929, which is 15,000 too many in my opinion, to 25,000 in 1935. And we see parallels like that with the leaps and bounds increase in the membership of the Democratic Socialists of America. The Socialist Party garnered 267,000 votes in the 1928 presidential election and 900,000 votes in the 1932 presidential election. By 1939, the CPUSA retained 80,000 to 90,000 members. And where FDR comes in, FDR, in my essays, I might seem to romanticize him to some degree, but when you read between the lines, what he was doing is, and he's mentioned this in letters to his family members and amongst the upper class, he did that to protect his class. He knew that revolution was in the air. He mentioned, let's see, what did he say? Okay, in an interview with Emil Ludwig, who was, I think he was from Austria originally, a journalist, I think, FDR stated that his, quote, political motive was his, quote, desire to obviate revolution. I work in a contrary sense to Rome and Moscow. And FDR told a journalist in early 1935, I am fighting communism, Huey Longism, and Coglianism. And he admitted in 1936 that it was this administration which saved the system of private profit and free enterprise after it had been dragged to the brink of ruin. And there's a lot more here, like the second wave of New Deal reforms, according to FDR's son Elliot, was designed to cut the ground from under the demagogues. And he admitted that he worked to save our system, FDR, the capitalist system, from crackpot ideas. And of course, it is crackpot ideas. I mean, Marxism, Leninism, and fascism and socialism, as I understand it, meaning the nationalization of all or some of the means of production and the economy, is a crackpot idea. I mean, I'm sorry for some of my socialist friends who we might agree on certain things, but it is a crackpot idea, and we can do a whole show, Tim, on why, and we can sing on the virtues of capitalism, and and that could be another show perhaps. But now the interesting thing, and I did not know this, the New Deal was initially opposed by the Communist Party USA, rather viciously. According to Richard Pels, throughout 1935 and 1936, the communists kept up their attack on the New Deal, asserting that the Democrats were as much the agents of business, fascism, and war as the Republicans. The Daily Worker, I don't know, we should probably call it the Daily Anti-Worker, called FDR's Social Security program, quote, one of the biggest frauds ever perpetrated on the people of this country. In an editorial critical of Roosevelt, The Voice of Action, which was another publication of the CPUSA back then, stated in August 7, 1933, it fumed, since taking the oath of office, there has been a continuous evasion of doing anything for the working class, and said the bankers were provided for first. When the banking holiday was declared, huge loans or gifts were made to the railroads and big business. A military system of forced labor camps was instituted in the form of the Civilian Conservation Corps under the original name of the Federal Unemployed Reserves. And now there has been enacted the National Industrial Recovery Act, giving to the president all the powers of a dictator. I.F. Stone, who was subsidized at one point by the Soviets, he said that, quote, Roosevelt's policies can be welded into a consistent whole only of the basis of one hypothesis, that Mr. Roosevelt intends to move towards fascism. When criticizing the New Deal, Stalin noted, quote, without getting rid of the capitalists, without abolishing the principle of private property, it is impossible to create a planned economy. And another well-known Soviet economic planner, Eugen Varga, believed that the New Deal sacrificed the interests of individual capitalists to protect the ruling class as a whole. Even the Socialist Party leader Norman Thomas wrote in the Anti-New Deal pamphlet written in 1936, he said that calling the New Deal, quote, socialism was a, quote, false charge and a, quote, amazingly bad imitation of the Socialist Party platform. He wrote that FDR did not carry out the socialist platform unless he carried it out on a stretcher. And, he went on and on, and I quote at length here, and it was very significant is the DSA, the Democratic Socialists America, that organization that's worming its way into the progressive populist wing of the Democratic Party. They reprinted Thomas's position on the New Deal. So the Chicago chapter of the DSA republished Norman Thomas's anti-New Deal pamphlet, which is very significant. I would love to see, I'm not drinking malicious joy, but I would like to see a split between the Bernie and especially Elizabeth Warren type Democrats versus the DSA. And I think if that opportunity ever happened, it will be a sharp split. But that's what's going on now. The fascists, they hated the New Deal too. Father Coughlin of the National Union for Social Justice, or I guess we can call it Injustice, claimed that the FDR administration was, quote, wedded basically to the philosophy of the money changers. He initially supported the New Deal.
Right. I want to just expand on who he was for a moment, if I may.
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
I don't think he's real well known these days. So I saw a really good documentary about him called The Radio Priest. So he was a Catholic priest from somewhere in the Midwest, I believe. He's the guy who coined the phrase social justice, as far as I know, because he had a newsletter with that title. He's a very well-known national radio broadcaster, like what we would call a talk show host these days. And he was, as you said, originally in favor of the New Deal, but then he later turned on it. And I think he's very significant because I think he's one of the big precursors to later people like Pat Buchanan and other sort of, uber Catholic, fascist sympathizing types. So I just want to make sure everybody understands, who he was. And I believe he ended up having to go off to the air because he got in a spat with Roosevelt.
Well, yeah, he took the side of the Axis. There was a noticeable pro-Axis movement in the United States. In social justice, it's available on unz.org, Ron Unz's site, and there's a lot of periodical literature there, and copies of social justice are available. Off the top of my head, I'm speaking extemporaneously. So copies of social justice does go over the platform, and there's this common position that all of Roosevelt's opponents on the quote-unquote right or quote anti-communist side, like Coughlin, were somehow in the employ of the American Liberty League, which was full stop anti-New Deal and very anti-labor organization of business people, journalists, politicians from both sides, Democrats and Republicans. And actually, that was not the case. People like Father Coughlin, William Dudley Pelley's Silver Shirts, the Ku Klux Klan, even the Black Legion, Joseph McWilliams, which was of the Christian Mobilizers, I believe, and then it became the American Destiny Party. They were all very anti-capitalist. They were for a private economy and in theory and practice, but severely smothered by all sorts of control and reinforced by totalitarian party. And then that Coughlin's National Union for Social Justice called for the confiscation of all sorts of profits, the conscription of all private wealth, the replacement of our Congress with a corporative state. Now, again, another thing, people confuse on the left and the right what corporatism is. Corporatism is a state-mandated class collaboration where the unions and the business association are literally arms of the governing fascist party. And that's actually how it is. And they misquote Mussolini. I really get frustrated, all honesty, Tim, when people misquote Mussolini when they say fascism is the merger of corporations and state. Well, the corporations in fascism is the state-organized groupings where government and party orders are dictated to the industrialists, the bankers, and the landowners, and they have to follow orders. It was not where companies just got to do whatever they want and dictate it to the fascist party. Now, of course, there was a lot of complications in this. They had power and influence, but it was not as great as people said. And in fascist and National Socialist states during and before World War II, they were very heavily taxed. You talk about excess profits tax. And all of these fascist countries and collaborationist states immediately had excess profits tax or extraordinary profits tax. That was actually the term that they did that. And they didn't do it because, they wanted to save capitalism. They wanted to create a new order that repudiated the class warfare of Marxism as well as liberal capitalism. But I don't mean to digress. So Coughlin, Long, they all opposed this. Hitler's Third Reich felt in 1934 and 1935, the German Nazis unfavorably compared the New Deal with Hitler's alleged successful recovery program. The USA was portrayed as a land of unemployment and strikes. FDR ultimately was portrayed as a supporter of ineffective liberal democracy with weakened state power. Now, I also will say that Hitler tried to establish a détente with Roosevelt because Hitler wanted to abolish capitalism and Roosevelt wanted to save the system, but the Nazis appreciated how Roosevelt was trying to overcome oligarchic private sector power in the courts and in the Congress and in the media, and the Nazis liked that. And they wanted to have a sort of détente with Hitler. And they made positive comments about the New Deal, even the NRA, as examples of controlled economy and a sort of pushback against economic liberalism until about 1936, 1937. But at the same token, the Nazis were not interested in half measures, and they knew that these were at the end of the game. At the end of the day, they were half measures. You know, there was a pamphlet issued by Robert Ley of the Nazi Labor Front. That was their fake trade union. It was, again, a corporatist institution which brought employers and workers together, but they straitjacketed them under the control of a vast party bureaucracy, and they controlled labor and capital very heavily. And Robert Ley was one of the many party radicals. In fact, it's a myth that Hitler purged all the party radicals in, what was it, I think June of 1934. A lot of party radicals remained after the Rome purge of 1934. According to a pamphlet issued by Robert Ley of the Nazi Labor Front, the New Deal represented a, quote, confused liberal system which did not ameliorate the conditions of the working and middle classes. Ley quipped, the capitalists presented themselves as socialists. Another Labor Front pamphlet claimed that since the New Deal allegedly was a failure, FDR overcame, quote, the economic crisis through war profits to satisfy the stock exchange and armaments Jews. Now, the Communist Party then, by 1936, although William Z. Foster still was very critical of the New Deal, the Communist Party made a strategic decision to develop a popular front to align with Western free governments in Europe as well as in the United States in an anti-fascist alliance. But they really didn't like Roosevelt. Roosevelt was using them, and the communists were using him. It was a sort of quid pro quo, but they never really trusted him. And the Gary, Indiana school superintendent, Dr. William Wirt, who attended allegedly parties of New Deal functionaries, including also the Soviet representative of the TASS News Bureau, fake news bureau. And they talked about how the New Deal was infiltrated by the communists, not because they wanted to make the capitalist system better or tinker with it. They wanted to destroy it and infiltrate it from within. So according to Wirt, the communists embedded in the New Deal bureaucracy said that FDR was only the Kerensky of this revolution. We are on the inside. We can control the avenues of influence. We can make the president believe that he's making the decisions for himself. So that really doesn't speak complimentary of Roosevelt. It clearly shows that Roosevelt was going in this direction and the communists wanted a different direction when you really look at what the quote is saying implicitly. When you're saying that you're Kerensky, that's kind of insulting because in the communist side, what happened to Kerensky? Kerensky was this kind of mild-mannered social reformer who was anti-Bolshevik, but kind of did the deal with the Bolsheviks to unite against the Tsarist forces, General Kornilov, in the attempted military coup against the short-lived democratic, mildly social reformist provisional government in Russia. And they kind of just pushed him out. He fled in exile, fled for his life. And he became, of course, a very staunch anti-communist, by the way, even criticized our rapprochement with Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia, said you can't trust communists even when they split. And that was Kerensky saying that. So, you know, they really know the game. When you live and eat and breathe that stuff and you see communist treachery, you understand you can't trust them. That's the leadership of the communists or Nazis. So when you look at that, you have this whole situation, you have a problem. So this notion that the New Deal was a socialist plot, well, that's not necessarily the case. And Roosevelt was doing this more to save the system from its faults. And, you know, and I think the points you bring up are certainly very valid too. A lot of it brought up memory lane, memory lane, like, oh yeah, I remember that, blah, blah, blah. Now let's talk about the things that I support about the New Deal. We'll go over the research as well as the things that I have concerns about that really, even a good supporter of the New Deal really has to mention. So let me just go through here. Yada, yada, yada. Okay. Okay. Okay, so there were victories with the New Deal. There was good legislation like the glass.
You're a little bit off camera now, so.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Thanks. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I'm like leaning upwards to look at what I'm saying. For example, another good thing, the institution that was developed, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, between 1934 and 1941, it managed only 370 bank failures, which were obviously there was much more previously. That provides economic stability to the capitalist system. And to a guy like me,
I have an interesting comment on that.
Sure, go ahead.
So it turns out Roosevelt was actually against the FDIC.
Interesting.
Because he believed FDIC type schemes had already been tried before at the state level and they had failed. And that was because they created what's called moral hazard, basically that the banks would still make bad loans and they'd end up needing to get bailed out. And with after they passed the national FDIC, basically, the banking system had already been stabilized. So that happened, without FDIC involvement. And there were a bunch of, I was looking into it, there were a bunch of other countries that either didn't have FDICs or some still don't have them, and they didn't have anywhere near as many bank failures as we did. So I really don't think that the FDIC Roosevelt ultimately did end up supporting it and signing it into law, but it took a while for him to be, finagled into that by the political system.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, that was, as I was writing here, it says there was New Deal era banking regulations that were imposed very early on, like Glass-Steagall, for example, which was actually officially known as the Banking Act of 1934. And for those who don't know what that was separated, put a sort of firewall between investment and commercial banking. And as I mentioned before, banking was highly speculative at that point. And I support a robust financial industry. I have nothing against investment or private investment, private banking, commercial banking, even investment banking. And one of the problems is when you go into the community of investment bankers, there was a very good New York Times article written by James Polk, who was a hedge fund trader, made a lot of money. And there are many examples of this historically and currently. There's this view, it's not like, hey, I'm creating a new product and I'm interested in the longevity of the company and the business and its staying power. Is a very different mentality, and that is it's very much in short term, disregarding the consequences of your actions to the nation, to your people, even to the products and whatnot that might be manufactured or distributed. So, banking laws like Glass-Steagall, like the uptick rule, that really put restraints that were long, long overdue in the financial sector. And even individuals, and I'm saying this extemporaneously, I don't have the quotes, but they are they're in one of my Hard Truth of Capitalism series. Where you had William Seidman, who worked with Alan Greenspan himself, and former Congressman, later George W. Bush era SEC Chairman Christopher Cox, all hardcore proponents of deregulation and financialization. They even said that the deregulation, they were wrong in their assumptions that this blanket, or what I like to term sometimes crony deregulation, just not work as planned. It was very utopian and whatnot, and they did their mea culpas, which I think is very, very significant. Now, from my notes, or really from my essay, the gross domestic product rose throughout FDR's first two terms, except for the period from 1937 to 1938. Average growth rates range from 8 to 10%. According to the political scientist Larry Bartels, in the 1936 election, FDR did best in the states that happened to enjoy robust income growth in the months leading up to the vote. While there was some improvement in private sector employment under the New Deal, citizens who worked in New Deal agencies and programs such as the WPA were incorrectly counted by anti-New Deal conservatives as unemployed. And this affected by the portrayal of the New Deal, especially by conservative and libertarian writers, although it sounds like the one that you quoted is more nuanced. According to Roshway.
So on that point, he does count. He doesn't really criticize the work relief programs, but he does count them as not being part of the private employment count. So when he's talking about the effect on total employment, he's not including the people who are on government work relief jobs.
Right, and that's important because the private market indeed was failing. There was a failure in the private enterprise, unfortunately.
Yeah.
According to Roshway, the WPA, PWA, and the TVA, quote, modernized the South and the West and created the infrastructure that permitted the wartime and post-war prosperity. And in taking your point, I think I learned something new about the TVA that doesn't necessarily surprise me, because I'm all for governmental infrastructure because it does help citizens as well as businesses move goods. In the case of businesses, and water transportation, dredging projects are very, very critical. And that's actually something I've studied very closely, is the maritime and industrial history of New York. And yes, with the building of expressways like the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway in New York City, there was massive amounts of displacement, the opening of ports and whatnot. That does occur. There's no question about it. That is a historical fact. But it did create a lot of infrastructure that ultimately was of use for the business sector as well as the citizens, and in areas where there was no immediate profit to be made by the private sector. What else to
yeah. Well, to buy yourself a moment of time there, I would comment on that I live on a lake that is a reservoir for a hydroelectric dam here outside of Houston, Texas, Lake Conroe, and Houston has another one called Lake Houston. And basically all the lakes in Texas are artificial like that. And that's something that I think is fairly appropriate. It could be done privately, and I'd like to see that tried more. There was actually an earlier attempt at the TVA by Henry Ford and Thomas Edison. They want to do a private version of the TVA beforehand, but they were never able to get the government approval to do it. So in that sense, having the government do it is actually a bit of a deregulatory thing. The government can let itself do something that it won't let the private sector do. So I would argue that those sorts of projects are beneficial and need to be done, but I think they could be done a lot more by the private sector if we really wanted to let them try.
Yeah, and that's open for debate and discussion too as well. Concerning Social Security, before it was inaugurated in 1934, about 50% of America's seniors lived below the poverty line. And as the program expanded, the poverty rate of seniors fell to 35% in 1959, 25% in 1970, 15% in 1975, and around 10% in 2000. If there was no Social Security, the senior poverty rate would be 43.5%. And that is from really not a particularly, it's a very academic kind of source from the National Academy of Social Insurance, so by Benjamin Veit, Social Security's Past, Present, and Future. So now my criticisms of the New Deal. Really with the National Recovery Administration, to me, that is a bridge too far. That smacks of economic engineering where you're trying to rework the system. Now, when we were talking privately, I mentioned about General Hugh Johnson, and he created the whole Blue Eagles. He led the National Recovery Administration. He later broke with Roosevelt, became a non-interventionist, and eventually then supported the war. But he was one of several in the administration that admired fascism, and at that time it was not unusual. You're dealing with a declining capitalist system worldwide in the non-capitalist freak economies of the world. So that was attractive, but it really bothered people. He brought in a meeting, and now I'm speaking extemporaneously, he brought to a meeting, a cabinet meeting, if I recall correctly, a copy of Mussolini's treatises on the development of the corporative state, the fascist third position economy. I'm saying this more to the audience. Third way between laissez-faire or liberal or plutocratic capitalism and Marxism-Leninism class struggle. And he brought that in, and Labor Secretary Frances Perkins, in her memoirs, was horrified by it and wrote about it. And other New Dealers were horrified about it too. And that was interesting. You had Rexford Tugwell, who was another New Dealer. He was an admirer of Mussolini's Italy and Soviet Russia. I mentioned that in my New Deal essay, by the way. Now, something very significant in too, which I will quote, by Stuart Chase. And he wrote in his book, and it is a true quote because I double checked it on Google Books. So I like to be careful with how I use my quotes. I try. Now, this is what he wrote. He believed that the ideal regime, quote, would have, this is my New Deal essay where I'm reading a lot of stuff that largely praises it, although not entirely, because you have to be fair. You got to give the whole picture here. And this types of infiltration and some of the policy pushes do bother me and concern me, because my goal is to stabilize the free system, free enterprise system, and free forms of government and avoid extremist revolution. That's just one of my biggest goals, and to do what I feel is the right thing by the American people. Stuart Chase wrote, and he was a prominent New Dealer, the ideal regime, quote, would have the clearest idea of what an economic system was for. The 16 methods of becoming wealthy would be proscribed by firing squad if necessary, ceasing to plague and disrupt the orderly process of production and distribution. Money would no longer be an end, but would be thrust back to where it belongs as a labor savings means. The whole vicious pecuniary complex would collapse as it has in Russia. Money making as a career would no more occur to a respectable young man than burglary, forgery, or embezzlement. And of course, as I comment in my New Deal essay, in other words, Chase advocated undiluted socialist despotism. So you have these elements in the New Deal.
Just to elaborate on that, so Chase, he was the one that wrote for the New Republic, right?
I do not know. Let me find the book here. Yeah. Let me quote it properly. I forget his position, but he was a prominent New Dealer.
I think he was in the Brain Trust.
He was. Stuart Chase. It's called A New Deal.
Yeah.
And I'm quoting from the Macmillan Company, New York, 1932 edition. Yeah. So before the New Deal, he's writing this, page 163.
Yeah, exactly. So Amity Shlaes has a fascinating story about him and Tugwell and a few others that they actually went to the Soviet Union in the late 1920s and met with Stalin and were favorably impressed by what they saw there and what Stalin was doing there. So that was a big influence on them. And I think Henry Wallace was there also in that meeting, if I remember correctly. So I think that amplifies your reasons to be concerned here about some of these people.
Well, because, when you're trying to reform capitalism and save capitalism, you cannot have these individuals in your government. Look, they're free people. They can write whatever they want. It's a free society. As you know, as most of the audience know, I work as a manager of a small library branch. I like freedom of speech in general. I know freedom of speech can be exploited by both left and fascist extremists, as well as also plutocratic elites, as Roosevelt called them, the economic royalists. They'll wrap themselves up in the Constitution, just like the National Lawyers Guild. For those of you who don't know in the audience, which was a communist front organization, it still exists today. It's still running around doing its mischief in certain cases, but it's a very good history of the National Lawyers Guild, a nonpartisan which actually quotes a number of their leaders from the 1960s and 1970s that said that. But anyways, so you can't have these people in government. I would never include them if I ever really had a political party that grew out of my radical civic nationalism, if you will, you can't cooperate with these people because our goals are just so radically different from each other that they really can't hold a conversation, because we would have nothing really to talk about. And I'm really not interested in that. There's another thing I came across. George N. Peake, who served in the FDR administration as the first chairman of the Export-Import Bank and the presidential foreign trade advisor. There was a split, and I didn't know this, and this is a work in progress for notes, called the coup against the economic nationalists. And apparently within the New Deal, there was a pro-banker, pro-Wall Street faction led by Cordell Hull, who was very pro-free trade. And then you had another element that was capitalist, but more economically nationalist within the Roosevelt administration. And he wrote a book, Peake, Why Quit Our Own? And it is available on the Internet Archive. And he was very critical of Cordell Hull and his circle, and very, very critical. Even Rexford Tugwell was very critical of Hull because he was more protectionist, and I do agree with Tugwell on that. He called them the rambling, lisping speeches on the evils of protection, and his extolling of the old laissez-faire liberal internationalism have become harder and harder to bear. That's what he recalled in meetings with Hull. And I guess I kind of understand Tugwell, even though I completely dislike his admiration or disagree with his admiration for fascist Italy and the USSR. And there was this clash between internationalist bankers distrusted FDR initially because they believed he was moving the country in the direction of national self-sufficiency. Even Roosevelt in the campaign against Hoover in 1932 said, look, I am for protecting our industry and our agriculture against dumping and whatnot. So, he wasn't this hardcore free trader, FDR, initially in the campaign. He wanted to allay certain concerns of legitimate concerns about industry and agriculture. However, with the ascension of Cordell Hull, who was a free trader and an internationalist and other corporate globalists, such concerns subsided amongst Wall Street banking community. In fact, Peake claimed that FDR became a tool of the Carnegie Endowment, the World Peace Foundation, and other pro-League of Nations internationalist groups. And Peake eventually resigned and accused Hull's policy of being un-American and internationalism gone wild. And he became more critical of domestic aspects of the New Deal too, as well, George N. Peake. And until maybe like about 5 or 6 years ago, I never even heard of him. So I thought it was very interesting.
His name came up in my reading, but I didn't get to read a whole lot about him.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting stuff. So my summation of the New Deal is it was largely good, but I think you also bring up a lot of valid points that need to be taken into account. But where I really differ from the New Deal, and I think it's just probably telling with the discourse I'm engaging in right now, is the National Recovery Administration, which you described to a T. What it is was a government-supervised cartelization of industry that actually marginalized the needs of labor and small and medium-sized businesses. It was more of an economic reorganization, and that's really where I draw the line. And when you have the head of the National Recovery Administration being an admirer initially of Italian fascism, that's where it raises my red flags. When you look at the Agricultural Justice Administration, I mean, certainly I'm familiar with what you have talked about because that was an argument by opponents of the AAA, and I really don't have an answer on how we could have handled the agricultural situation. Of course, if I was president, I would go with advisors who I trust, who share my vision, but who can sometimes deviate from it within certain framework. And I would consult with them because you had a huge problem. You had the Dust Bowl, you had You add also the overproduction, and how do you deal with that without, killing agriculture and killing and allowing the price of agricultural produce to plummet. So there's real difficult situations that you're dealing with here. And my last critique of the New Deal, as I said, is also, it's also a cautionary tale that you don't let members of the Communist Party USA, either open or secret, into your government, because they're not going to share your vision. They want to penetrate a bureaucracy in various agencies, not to ultimately create an improved form of capitalism, but as William Wirt said, they wanted to completely destroy it. And they really didn't have particularly regard for Roosevelt. And I've used Grok, but it's not reliable with deep searches because I was not able to, through using Google Books, interlibrary loans and whatnot, to find the sources of the quotes. But if we're one to believe it, and I did find it in actually John Earl Haynes and Harvey Clare's book on American communism, one of them where William Z. Foster actually continued to oppose the New Deal. They were a little more quieter about it, but if you were to believe Grok, they were furious about the New Deal. They hated it. They didn't want anything to do with it. They kind of held their noses and whatnot and blah, 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 blah. It was the same thing about the Great Society, where they publicly not praised it fully, the Communist Party USA. I mean, even Gus Hall said it's like a horse, but two very different wings and destinations. When you kind of see those comments, and if Grok was correct, it quoted party leaders behind the scenes in secret meetings. They absolutely hated it. And you mentioned about Keynes. I did not know this, but Keynes actually, there's a lot of misquoting, and we can do a different show on it. But the Soviets under Stalin and his successors did not like Keynes. The Nazis and the Volkischer Beobachter, when they were condemning neoliberalism, I know you posted that one time on my timeline, and I knew exactly what you're talking about. The Vienna issue of the Volkischer Beobachter, which was the Nazi party newspapers, a major one, it was attacking Keynes in 1944. Its author of that article was a gentleman by the name of Fritz Nonnenbruck. He was an ex-German communist who became a Nazi. And he was saying basically, let me see if I can actually find it. Yeah, it's a very revealing article where they were attacking Keynesianism and these sort of social democratic reforms. Okay. He wrote, it was in a May 12th, 1944 article. He said the age of liberalism, which regarded the economy as a natural or even God-given mechanism, is definitely over, but liberalist economic thinking is so firmly rooted that it has not been completely eradicated either by the bitterest experiences of the past or by the sight of new developments in Germany. Since old-style liberalism has failed in the face of the facts, it is reappearing, and he's talking to people like me, it is reappearing in a new guise as a kind of neoliberalism, and now, since it can only imagine economic activity as a mechanism, wants to incorporate a mechanism into it after it has become clear that the economic activity by itself is only a very unsatisfactory mechanism. And he was just talking about, if you realize this, you also have the decisive point at hand where the difference between National Socialist economic policy thinking and intentions and the neoliberal economic policy aspirations of plutocratic foreign countries lies. And when they see neoliberalism, this was written before the formation of the Mont Pelerin Society, by the way, which was formed in 1947. For the National Socialists, all economic policy tasks are management tasks. He can say this quite openly because the guiding principle of economic policy leadership is the welfare of the people. The Jewish financial plutocrats act as if the economy were a mechanism for them and lie about it, because by pointing to automatism in economic activity. They want to cover up the fact that they have constructed this mechanism with the will to achieve a political purpose, namely the oppression and exploitation of the people. The neoliberalism expressed in the American monetary plans under Roosevelt does not renounce economic management, but it is mendacious and denies it because it must deny it, for it can hardly openly confess the exploitations of the peoples as the goal of its will to lead. And those last two sentences are very significant because they basically are saying, guys, to people like me, cut the bullshit. You really support capitalism, and therefore you're an exploiter and a Jew. And that's really what it comes down to. They really don't like it. And the Soviets did not like Keynesianism either. And there's a lot of things. I was doing some research, like there are a lot of Keynes's opponents will quote partially his infamous quote, "The authoritarian state systems of today seem to solve the problem of unemployment at the expense of efficiency and of freedom." But the part of the quote that's left out by Keynes, it says, "But it may be possible by a right analysis of the problem to cure the disease while preserving efficiency and freedom." So he's saying, I don't support the Nazi system. I still want freedom. And you kind of even mentioned that a little bit, inferred that in your point too as well.
Yeah.
So there's a full quote. He said, "It is certain that the world will not much longer tolerate the unemployment which is associated, in my opinion, inevitably associated with present-day capitalistic individualism, but it may be possible by a right analysis of the problem to cure the disease while preserving efficiency and freedom." He even condemned the British pacifist left. I did not even know this. He said the intelligentsia of the left were the loudest in demanding that the Nazi aggression should be resisted at all costs. When it comes to a showdown, scarce 4 weeks have passed before they remember that they are pacifists and write defeatist letters to your columns, leaving the defense of freedom and civilization to Colonel Blimp and the old school tie, for whom 3 cheers. Is kind of, that's a British cultural phrases, I think, that means more of a conservatism, patriotism. Yeah. And, he has condemned the Soviet Union, apparently. Red Russia holds too much, which is detestable. In 1925, I am not ready for a creed which does not care how much it destroys the liberty and security of daily life, which uses deliberately the weapons of persecution, destruction, and international strife. And I couldn't summarize Bolshevism better than Keynes. So the plot thickens. And even when I look at a lot of these Democrats and even some leftists, when you start to really peel away the layers, the conservatives don't have it 100% right. Like, they pick on Elizabeth Warren. And there are things I don't agree with Elizabeth Warren. There's money sources that I would not take money from, like Council for the Livable World, like what our friend and analyst Trevor Loudon, and scholar I would even call him, has revealed. But, for example, the Communist Party USA, here's a fact. They were pissed at her. They called her the erstwhile progressive because she stood up when President Trump in his first term said America will not be a socialist country. And she stood up and clapped. Warren Mass, who was a Bircher, totally misrepresented when Warren made a relatively well-known at the time foreign policy speech, and I think this was during the first Trump administration, maybe before, where she was alerting the world on the threat of Russia and China and urged America to have a whole of government strategy. And the Birch Society's New American, Warren Mass, one of their top writers, said, "Oh, she's admiring China." I'm like, wait a minute. I want to check that out. So I read the whole damn speech, and it's like, not that. Now, I think you and I have our criticisms of Warren. I've looked at her career. What I would like to see one day, and maybe this is Pollyannish on my part, where you have center-left people who are not batshit crazy, let's behead and guillotine landlords and bankers, not those crowd, but people who are center-left who still are anchored in the system of a relatively free government and economy with a understanding of the national security threats. And those on the right, whether libertarian or conservative, as well as independents, we could sit down at a big table and kind of negotiate and compromise and work out these problems. and really come to a common agreement and develop a new movement, a sort of new Sharon statement, if you will, which was William F. Buckley's statement on conservatism,
Right.
where we can really come up with something new but old. Now, if you want to, I know I spoke a lot, and I think you gave a lot of information that was very useful, including things that I didn't know. I'm always learning something from you, as well as all my other guests. Hopefully, I'm sure you know a lot of what I said because you're very well versed in historical. There might be certain new things that maybe I said that you didn't know. I don't know, but that's my take, if you will, on the New Deal. With privatizing Social Security, if we had a financial sector that was far more disciplined and more attuned to the institutional integrity of the financial sector and the system, unlike what Sam Polk and other hedge fund traders and officials have revealed, and ones that really are invested in the country and the system as a whole and more long-term investment thinking, then I would be more comfortable as long as there's checks and balances. The thing is I'm not, I get very, I guess, sometimes militant on Twitter, although I do try to explain myself when I'm very critical of neoliberalism. And that when I do that, I depart from let's say the DSA or CPUSA or Caleb Maupin CPI criticisms, to name several socialist or communist organizations, because my goal is not to bury capitalism or free enterprise. My goal is not to bury free government, but I have a deep skepticism of over-centralized government power, especially, and you have to also look at the ruling group, the political class. What are their intentions? The reason why I was like totally tripping about the NRA under Hugh Johnson is because he's handing out Mussolini's literature. That's why I'm tripping about that. If it's somebody like, I don't know, you calling for certain government programs, or me, or Pat Choate, I'm not going to be straight tripping about that. I'm not going to be like totally like stressed out about it, because I know your intentions, and you have to look at the intentions. What do you want? What do you want to do? And also, if you're creating these government institutions, what kinds of checks and balances are you going to put in to ensure that there's institutional integrity? Marjorie Taylor Greene, I reposted, I was shocked. She posted this about the creation of a sovereign wealth fund for the United States, and agree or disagree with it. I'm not super well versed. I know they have it in Norway, which is a very wealthy country, in part because of energy, oil exports, and oil production, at least at one time. But my concern, and this is my libertarian remnant coming out, well, how would you structure that? Would they be the members of the board of the sovereign wealth fund? Would they be appointed to the board? And would they be elected? What qualifications, what terms, what power, terms of service they have? I have a lot of questions about that, because you don't want an elected government that comes in that's very corrupt. And I would argue that MAGA and Trump in the second term especially is very, very corrupt. I wouldn't trust them. I wouldn't trust if you had the DSA bringing a government in power, and let's say in some far off future, they do that and develop a policy like that. So I know I'm kind of rambling on and on. I hope you were taking mental notes with what I'm saying.
Oh, yeah.
You want to respond, have at it. I'm going to get a drink because I need one.
Yeah. I'm actually going to suggest that we both take a very quick break here, and I'll come right back. So you'll have to edit it out in the post-production, I think. Okay.
Good idea.
Okay. So I think where I would want to take things up again, if this is an appropriate moment, there's one major topic that I couldn't quite figure out how to work in to my presentation earlier, because it's not so much about the Depression or the New Deal itself, but prior to that period. But I think it's incredibly relevant to both that period and later American history. So I did mention briefly how in the 19th century, the left-wing working class movements of the world were very in favor of free trade, and that's true. What I didn't realize before I started doing all this research on the topic was not only that, but how all of the trust busters back then, so the antitrust movement, they were called trust busters, and what we now call monopolies or cartels. We had all these various trusts running around. We had the oil trust, we had the sugar trust, etc. All of the trust busters were anti-tariff and pro-free trade. Mm-hmm. And I came across this wonderful quote I want to read from the guy who was the head of the Sugar Trust in America. His name was Henry Osborne Havemeyer.
Mm-hmm. Havemeyer, yep.
Yeah, so
big sugar guy. Domino Sugar in New York City, I don't mean to interrupt, used to be at one time their refinery in Williamsburg. When you look at the old U.S. Army Corps port series list, it lists all the docks. It used to be called, before it was Amstar and Domino Sugar, was Havemeyer in Williamsburg and Brooklyn by the Williamsburg Bridge. I don't know if you know New York City well or not.
I don't.
Yeah.
So he ended up giving congressional testimony somewhere towards the end of his career. He was president of the company, and at the time, while he was president of the company, they controlled 98% of all sugar refining in the U.S. And he basically said, I'm the head of the Sugar Trust in America, and the tariff is the mother of all trusts. He said that the sugar tariff was what created the Sugar Trust, and the Sugar Trust was going to perpetuate the sugar tariff ever since then. And that has turned out to be true. So, for instance, to this day, I forget exactly how much of it, but there's a great deal of the U.S. sugar market that is controlled by these Cuban-American guys out of Florida.
The Fonjules, located in West Palm Beach. Very powerful people.
Exactly right, yeah. And so they consolidated a lot of this. And we still have a sugar tariff here in America. Last I heard, the net result of that is that sugar prices here in America are roughly double that of the world price of sugar. And that is also a big reason why the carbonated beverage industry decided to come up with high fructose corn syrup as a substitute for sugar, supposedly cheaper. And here now we have our new Health and Human Services Secretary, RFK Jr., running around talking about banning high fructose corn syrup. And every time I hear that, I just want to tell him, just abolish the sugar tariff. And there's no longer any economic sense in having high fructose corn syrup in carbonated beverages. We could just actually go back to real sugar again. But it turns out that's not the only industry where that kind of thing happened. It happened all over the place. And one of the most interesting stories I found was about the Homestead strike for Carnegie Steel in the 1890s, when Carnegie's operations were being run by his partner, Henry Frick. So it turns out Frick waited to right after the passage of a steel tariff under the president, McKinley at that time, to announce a wage cut for his employees, because all of a sudden they would have less opportunities to work elsewhere or other steel companies that were more reliant on imported steel. Then he announced the wage cut, and that caused the strike, and that strike turned out to be very bloody. It was one of the worst strikes in terms of violence in American history. I didn't realize that tariffs played that kind of role in this. So what I ended up realizing is that, yes, by the late 19th century, early 20th century, capitalism in America was very unbalanced, and there was a greater concentration of wealth. And in every case that I looked at, it was due to a tariff or a subsidy, but a lot of them were tariffs designed to protect those industries. So, for instance, Standard Oil benefited from a tariff on kerosene in its early days. And the main source of foreign competition for him was kerosene out of Russia. And these are not, just, there happened to be a tariff and, it benefited somebody. It was a big thing for him in his business strategy to make sure that, the United States government passed tariffs that would benefit his companies and his industry. It was something he consciously pursued and thought about. What I realized is that this was one of the primary mechanisms for redistributing wealth from the poor to the rich in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century. And they all knew this. They all understood this. All the trust busters talked about it and were against it.
Most of them were against that. The only one of note that comes to my mind who shifted his position, was a trust buster and was a capitalist, and I've read some of his writings, or certainly excerpts of it, was Teddy Roosevelt. At one time he was a free trader, and then he flipped, and he was a trust buster. And it's interesting you bring up tariffs. I'm glad you brought that up, because tariffs originally were, when it was the Tariff Act was first passed in 1789, it was meant not only to be revenue, but especially to develop industry. And it did help develop and stimulate industry in the United States as well as elsewhere, but it also had many of these effects. And you had all kinds of political chicanery with lobbying for differing tariffs throughout at least half of our history. And what happened was also you had these huge conglomerates that developed railroads, banking.
Yep.
Banking was actually infamously anti-tariff and still is anti-tariff.
Right.
So it goes both ways, the developments of the big monopolies. But also during this time period with the increased globalization, you also had tremendous amounts of monopolization too. It went in the other direction, like you take the textile industry, for example. Walmart, big retail like Walmart and other retail distributors, they actually opposed controls on dumped tariff exports from communist China. And when President Carter and Reagan, they were trying to negotiate the multi-fiber agreements, it was actually the cartel increasingly monopolized retail lobby that actually pushed against any tariffs or quotas, including the multi-fiber agreement. So it really goes both ways. I think
it does. I agree.
But the issue is private power that's unaccountable and let out of control, and they use either tariff or free trade for their own economic benefit, and that's what it comes down to.
Yes, but I would interpret, the Walmarts and also to a great extent Amazon these days as they've basically been captured by the Chinese manufacturing cartel. So I think that's an instance where China is basically trying to reproduce this same protected manufacturing market with then subsidized exports to dump on the rest of the world. We actually pioneered that here in America in the late 19th century and early 20th century. That's what we were doing. And I think that was wrong for us to do, but that's what China's doing now. And they've basically turned Walmart and these other, mass manufacturing consumer retailers into, their fronts. They're basically allowing China to do that to us, what we did to the rest of the world back then. And I'm sure if you ask China, they'll say, oh yes, that's exactly what we're doing. They think this is how you develop, this is how you industrialize. So the really interesting contrast here that I looked into on this was the late 19th century British Empire, because the British Empire abolished all their tariffs in the middle of the 19th century. And I was looking into, they controlled 25% of the land surface area of the globe and all the oceans because they had that big a navy. And, I always heard all my life critics of capitalism saying, oh, the problem of capitalism is you have these natural monopolies that spring up. And Adam Smith never thought about that. Well, it turns out that the late 19th century British economy was much less concentrated in terms of industry than the American economy was. And that is apparently, as far as I can tell, because they had free trade and we had all these tariffs. And I think, I think there is a case to be made for some strategically targeted tariffs. I'm enough of a libertarian heretic to allow for that. But a lot of them are not like that. And a lot of these were clearly done to protect not just industry, but it was these, plutocratic capitalist captains of industry, that were, demonized as the robber barons of the Gilded Age. I think not everybody who's been accused of that is guilty of it, but some clearly were. And they did it largely at the expense of the American consumers and their workers. So I think that, that was a big factor that is sorely neglected in all the other accounts of history that I've seen. And I do think that it's relevant to later, like late 20th century and early 21st century American economic policy, but I don't think we're going to have time to talk about that this time. We're going to have to cover that another time.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover. Yeah, I think it's an issue. Tariffs or free trade are used as tools by unaccountable private sector elites to fatten their wallets. Now, Walmart and Amazon, they had agency. They had tremendous political power. They basically, Walmart's, the Amazons, they own the store. They have outsized influence. And look, let me make it clear and I've mentioned this before, private sector needs a seat at the table. They're important parts of the economic community. I look at economics as an organism, very similar to the reform capitalist Nick Hanauer. And that is that it's like an organism. Everybody needs each other. The worker, the employee, the shareholder, the consumer, the government, the nation state. We all need each other. And theoretically, it's supposed to work in harmony and with respect for each other. So they need to have a seat at the table. But the problem is that they made a conscious business decision for especially their shareholders, because this occurred with the rise of the shareholder is the only thing important with capitalism. And that was part of that was rooted in our history in the Dodge decision, court decision, as well as also the works of Milton Friedman and Michael Jensen and Theodore Levitt. And that really gave rise in the 1970s, and Jack Welch, formerly of GE, General Electric, popularized this view. So they did that. And there's the histories of Walmart actually talk about that. And it was, according to one retired Walmart senior executive, this is in my book, my two-part series book, called Turning the Page. And a Walmart senior executive said, Sam, meaning Sam Walton, the founder of Walmart, for those of you who don't know, Sam was an advocate of importing. And Walmart's ties with China was very interesting. It dated as far back as the 1980s. And initially, Walmart kept these connections quiet in order to avoid the potential backlash. of being an unpatriotic corporation. This was a time when Walmart was making a big thing about the Buy America campaign, and they wanted to keep that secret. According to Bob Ortega, from the beginning, Walton had bought goods wherever he could get them the cheapest, with any other consideration secondary. He increasingly looked for imports, which were usually cheaper because factory workers were paid so much less in China and the other Asian countries. By the way, not capitalist countries, even by my standards necessarily. According to one retired senior Walmart Hong Kong executive, the decision was to go to an exclusive buying agency to procure imports while not being exposed as going into communist China. By the late 1980s, 14 out of 22 shoe and boot brands sold at Walmart were manufactured in China. By 1981, Walmart executives quietly visited China to attend the Canton, which is now, I think, Guangzhou. You know, it's the different ways of speaking Chinese. Canton Trade Fair, and inspected factories operating by Walmart's Hong Kong based vendors. And, you know, I could go on and on. So really and truly, it's a conscious decision that was made. There's a very good book. You probably heard about it. He's a European trade union official, Charles Levinson, wrote a book called Vodka Cola, which talked about these joint ventures and even outsourcing of production to Eastern European countries, even as far back as the 1960s and 1970s. And it developed these sort of symbiotic partnerships of communist bloc state enterprises and select Western European businesses, and some American businesses even at that time, though more limited. And it's really that model where they knew what they were doing. They weren't ensnared or fooled or anything. They knew. They made a conscious business decision. They generally got away with it. I mean, there was uproars and people were pissed because of the unemployment. It affected West German and French and other workers in Western Europe. So it was controversial. And of course, that also has plagued the United States. Now, my position on tariffs, I mean, many people know. For those of you who are first-time listeners, you know, I support industrial policy, but it has to be very intelligent and carefully crafted. I don't support Trump's 0 to 60 approach, where you're just jacking up tariffs to 160%, over 100%, especially on allies. It's kind of like weaning an alcohol or drug addict off of the substance abuse. You got to do it gradually. You got to nurture and develop your industries. You got to protect it. It's like having a puppy and you're buying it really young. You got to feed it. You got to care for it. You got to bring it to the doctor. You got to give it love. And you got to eventually push it to be a little self-sufficient and independent, or like a child. And that's what you got to kind of do to redevelop industry. I mean, the deindustrialization of the United States, it started in the 1950s. If you were to believe, of course, the works and the investigations of people like Senator, I think it's Robert Malone of Nevada. He's a well-known conservative Republican, and it was an economic nationalist. He wrote a book called Mainline, and he talked about it, and several other Republicans. It was a very big protectionist wing of the Republican Party after World War II that was pretty powerful. And they were very conservative. But some of them were also non-ideological, like Robert Taft. There's a lot I found out about Robert Taft I never knew, and which was a very fascinating character in some ways. And the deindustrialization started then when my parents were kids and teenagers. It wasn't like critical mass, but it was gaining notice. Clyde Prestowitz and others have written about this. The history, very fascinating stuff.
Well, I think it really took off in the 1960s.
Yes.
But again, I think a full discussion of that needs to be deferred to a later show.
Yeah, sorry.
But the more immediate thing that I think we can cover now is that I think with these types of trade policies, free countries need to make a decision about how much trade they're going to have with unfree countries.
Yes.
And I came across a really great example of this, again, from 19th century Britain, where there was a conflict between the free trade movement in Britain at the time, which was mostly working class, and the anti-slavery campaign that was mostly being run by the Royal Navy over imported sugar from Brazil, because most of the imports from Brazil, the sugar plantations in Brazil still had slavery. It was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to have slavery. They didn't abolish it until the 1880s. And basically the anti-slavery campaign didn't want to allow Brazilian sugar imports, and the free trade people did. And I thought that was a very interesting conflict because in a lot of ways, those campaigns were originally very much in alignment with each other. The free trade campaign and the anti-slavery campaign agreed on a lot of stuff, but they eventually came to this point of conflict. And for us today, I think with countries like China, we really need to decide a lot more consciously and carefully than we have about, how much trade is really in our interest to have with those countries. Another company besides Walmart that I know, went big into China as a supplier for manufactured goods early on in the 80s was, believe it or not, Victoria's Secret.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Victoria's Secret figured out that they could get Chinese sweatshops to do knockoffs of designer fashions for them without the designer label, and make a huge amount of money importing them into the country and selling them to the U.S. consumers. And I don't know exactly how much of their sourcing now is from China still today. I think they've diversified somewhat, but that's the kind of thing where we need to really decide for ourselves, how beneficial that really is. What I don't like about a lot of the economists that look at this is they just look at it purely as an economic transaction only, and they don't seem to care at all about there being any not only national security implications, but also social stability implications for us. Do we really want to have every American worker in the country's job depend on whether or not we're going to let their job be outsourced to some country like China that still has full-blown slave labor?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, my view on tariffs is I believe in a gradual increase in tariffs, but there also has to be a complement of a combined hybrid, and I write about this, of libertarian policies as well as also more what you would probably consider statist policies working hand in hand. I think especially we have to gradually withdraw trading from our geopolitical adversaries, both indirectly and directly. It's very dangerous. You're right about the social stability. Basil Delgas, who was a former official, very high level, vice president of AMTOR, the American Soviet Trading Corporation, when he testified before Congress, because he renounced the Soviets, in 1930, he testified before Congress and said, one of the reasons why the Soviets launched a massive dumping offensive in global trade, even against the United States, was because not only to gain foreign currency, but also to create social instability. You dump products at low cost, slave labor or highly controlled labor, into a relatively free capitalist economy with higher wages and better working conditions. You're going to put industries and mines out of work and out of business. And they do that purposely to create chaos in the capitalist economy. In Cuba, in 1960, when we were still directly trading with Cuba, there were Cuban officials, I believe, that were caught at what used to be JFK Airport. Back then it was Idlewild Airport in New York City, and they were smuggling tobacco seed with the purpose of ultimately back into Cuba to then dump tobacco into the American market to help destroy the American tobacco industry. There's a lot of these. Yeah. The German Nazis were very into these schemes of dumping products in Europe, and they attempted to do that in the United States. And there were times where the Roosevelt administration at times did not stop that. Like, for example, and there were complaints from the anti-Nazi groups in the United States when building a big WPA project, a WPA success story, the Triborough Bridge in New York, that was built with Nazi steel partially. In that case, the Roosevelt administration allowed that. That was reported in the New York Times. And well, you got to be independent. You got to call it as it is.
Yeah.
What works, and if it's screwed up and wrong, you got to call it out. And this is why I'm not an ideologue and a partisan hack either, not on this show.
Yeah. I came up with another really interesting example of this kind of paradox in my reading about the Bretton Woods Agreement right after World War II, when we basically decided that the United States would be on the gold standard and then the US dollar would be the world's reserve currency. So it turns out the U.S. representative at Bretton Woods was Harry Dexter White, who was a Soviet agent, but as far as I can tell, according to it was a good book, he seems to have been acting pretty much sincerely in America's interests at that conference. Keynes was representing Britain, and he didn't want them to be on the gold standard because Britain couldn't afford it. So sorry, Britain, they lost out. But interestingly, even though I am generally speaking a gold standard advocate and think we ought to be on it, the other major world player that was in favor of it was Stalin. And the reason Stalin was in favor of it is because the Soviet Union was one of the world's biggest gold producers.
That's right. Yeah, every time they wanted to buy something, if they didn't have foreign currency or something to barter, and China did the same thing. And North Korea would do that too at one time before they screwed up their gold mines. I think at one point they got like flooded or something or whatever. But they would all just, boom, they would dump gold, boom, like that, boom, like clockwork. Yeah, the trade issue is very interesting. My positions on trade is very simple. I am for trade between allies and neutrals based on product quality. If it's non-market, non-product comparative advantages like slave labor, subsidized credits, dumping from state-subsidized or state-owned industries, or slave labor, or dummy yellow trade unions, to use a rather insulting term that the labor union movement uses towards totalitarian labor unions and totalitarian states. And there's a whole panoply of non-market, non-product related, quote, comparative advantages. Right. That's when you need to have steep or steady or incremental tariffs. But when it comes to, if you have a car that's coming in the United States, and even if it's subsidized by Japan or South Korea, but a high quality, then you subsidize our industries too. Because Japan and South Korea, their industries are nurtured by the state. And when you're a private company in a Western country and you're not subsidized, or there's really no consistent, streamlined industrial policy and a bipartisan consensus, a private company cannot compete against a state enterprise or a state subsidized private enterprise with comparatively unlimited resources. That's why when I posted on X about the sovereign wealth fund, my immediate concern was how is that going to provide unfair competition to private banks? My criticism, my concerns about the recent mayoral candidate, and I'll close on this, Mr. Zoran Mamdani, who's involved at a very high level with DSA, he mentions the creations, in order to allegedly help the consumer, the creation of 5 city-owned grocery stores. Well, the libertarian in me and the historian in me says, well, how is that going to potentially unfairly compete against mom and pop bodegas in Manhattan? And I think that's a legitimate question, because why? Tim, that's happened in history. It happens in global trade when American companies that are not maybe adequately subsidized, perhaps, or protected, if you want, against non-product, non-market advantages, well, they're put behind the 8 ball. And that's my concern domestically, too. So that's my issue with the free trade. One of the biggest issues with the free trade community, this notion that it's gifts to the American consumer. No, I'm sorry. Tell that to the people in Youngstown, Ohio, for example, and get back to me.
Yeah. Well, the way I would put it is that I think we rightly need protection against unfree labor. And the other aspect of this is that the financial standards that a lot of these other foreign countries are held to are non-existent or woefully inadequate. I mean, China basically said, we're not going to do that. And yet we allowed all these Western investors to invest in businesses in China that if they were operating here, they would never be allowed to touch because they just don't have the financial transparency. And China has absolutely no interest in even trying to do that. So again, I think coming up with standards like that is a perfectly reasonable and appropriate thing for us to do in deciding who we're going to allow to be our trade partners.
Well, we're getting near and near to the top of the hour. I think this has been a great show. I think maybe we can do another show on trade or perhaps some other topics. We were going to talk about Iran or Israel. Maybe we could talk about the next time because that is a timely topic. Where can people find your work, Tim? Are you active in social media? And where can people find your readings, please?
So I am on X. I have a relatively early account, so it's pretty easy. It's my name, TIMSTARR01 on X. And then I have published some things at both a couple of small websites, Libertarian, and there's also another very small free market think tank run out of Switzerland. Can't remember exactly what it is right now. Sorry. I published a couple of things there, like a critique of Hans Hermann Hoppe. Hoppe decided to defend Marxist class theory and his own version of it. And I think that is bad both in the Marxist form and in his form. And I'm on Facebook also. So those are where people can find me most easily.
Cool. And also you've had interviews on other programs too as well, if you want to elaborate on that.
Yes, right. So yeah, my friend Matthew Bazinskis at Porkopolis Economics has had me on a couple of times. It's been fun to do that, as well as I got to do an episode on the Centrist Post YouTube channel run by Lauren Morris. She has a middle name that she uses, but I don't know how to pronounce it, so I'm not going to embarrass myself by getting it wrong. She's very active in Conservatives for Ukraine, and I'm a big Ukraine supporter, as well as Israel and, of course, America, because I think, their cause is very much in our interests. So, those are other places where people can look for my stuff if they want to.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. We're going to definitely have you again. Thank you for sharing all this information and for a very enriching discussion. And I think this is also good because if you get people that you won't always 100% agree with, even though we agree with similar goals and whatnot, I think that makes the discussion a little interesting. I mean, I know this was long. There was a lot of arcane facts that we went through, but I think this will allow the readers to get informed from both sides of an issue and really hopefully come to your own conclusions. Or the way I do things for the past many years, I kind of combine both sides to come up with my own understanding of what the truth is, because I find that every side almost has legitimate points to be making, but I think we can script what points we hybridize and weave together into a specific goal, which is the preservation of free society overall. And that's pretty much all I have to say. Well, thank you again, Tim. Thank you all for listening. Be sure to like this interview if you like, comment if you like, keep it nice, keep it respectful. Share this interview. God bless America. Everybody be safe. Let's pray for peace in the world. especially for the citizens, the average citizens on all sides in conflicts, not necessarily praying for certain governments like Hamas or Iran. I don't particularly care for them. I don't want to pray for them really because they're pretty awful and stuff like that. But, let's pray for a peaceful and a better world and hopefully a more stronger and unified America. Thank you all. Be good to each other and be safe. All righty. God bless.